In 2015, a limestone cave in the Rhone Valley produced the most complete set of Neanderthal remains found anywhere in France since 1979. Researchers nicknamed the individual Thorin. This single discovery would go on to rewrite a huge chunk of what scientists thought they already understood. For decades, genetic research had painted a fairly simple picture, that the last Neanderthals belonged to one single, slowly fading lineage. But when scientists finally managed to unlock Thorin's ancient DNA, they uncovered something nobody expected. A ghost lineage, isolated for 50,000 years, genetically untouched by modern humans, completely invisible until this moment. This finding doesn't just tweak a small detail in prehistory. It reveals that our entire understanding of how Neanderthals disappeared was missing one of its most astonishing chapters. And the whole trail begins with a single tooth, and a question nobody was quite prepared to answer. The cave above the river. A narrow road winds its way through the Rhone Valley, cutting between pale limestone cliffs and a slow-moving river below. Perched on a rise above the water sits Grotta Mandrin, a shallow cave carved out of the stone by centuries of wind and time. For thousands of years, this modest shelter quietly watched the comings and goings of ancient hunters, its entrance conveniently facing south to catch the winter sun. In 2010, a research team, led by Ludovic Slimak, arrived at the site with shovels, trowels, and a firm commitment to carefully map out every single layer of sediment and every fragment of bone they could find. The cave's location wasn't chosen by accident. This valley functioned as a natural corridor, a genuine crossroads for both animals and people traveling between the Mediterranean coast and the heart of Ice Age Europe. Excavating Grotta Mandrin demanded serious patience. Season after season, Slimak's team carefully peeled back thin bands of wind-blown sand and silt, gradually revealing a record of human occupation stretching back more than 80,000 years. The layers stacked up like the pages of a book: fireplaces, flint tools, and the scattered bones of horses, reindeer, and bison. More than 60,000 individual stone artifacts and roughly 70,000 animal remains eventually surfaced from the site, uncovered in careful methodical succession. Because the cave's sediment had remained completely undisturbed for millennia, it preserved alternating traces of Neanderthal occupation and, in some of the upper layers, the very first modern humans to reach Western Europe. In 2015, as Slimak's crew worked carefully near the cave's entrance, they uncovered a cluster of teeth and bone fragments pressed into a shallow depression right beside the bedrock. The context was immediately unmistakable. This was the layer researchers call post-Neuronian II, representing the final Mousterian phase before modern humans ever arrived in the region. The team stopped all digging immediately. They sealed off the trench and meticulously documented every single detail. Strict protocols governed the entire removal process. Every find was carefully bagged, logged, and transported under guard directly to the laboratory. In the dim light of that cave, the significance was already obvious to everyone present. This ancient crossroads in the Rhone Valley had produced a Neanderthal, whose full story was still waiting to be uncovered. What Thorin's teeth reveal. Thorin's story is written most clearly through his teeth. 31 fossilized teeth, some still attached to fragments of jawbone, had survived somewhere between 42,000 and 52,000 years inside the cave's cool darkness. The nickname Thorin, borrowed from Tolkien's fiction, hints at a real sense of individuality. This wasn't just a random collection of remains, but genuine evidence of a person who once chewed, bit down, and lived an entire life in a world that has long since vanished. His dental anatomy quietly preserves a record of both daily hardship and rare good fortune. The crowns of his teeth are noticeably worn down from years of gnawing on tough roots and sinew, their edges chipped and pitted by the grit typical of an Ice Age diet. Interestingly, one molar is extra, a supernumerary tooth, a genetic quirk rarely seen in Neanderthals, and likely a subtle sign of just how isolated his particular lineage had become. The true scientific value of these teeth, though, lies deep inside them. Each tooth root encases a small chamber of dental pulp, soft tissue that was once threaded through with blood vessels and nerves. This pulp acts almost like a natural vault, shielding DNA from bacteria, water, and the slow, steady decay that erases most traces of ancient life. Even as the surrounding bone weathers and crumbles away over time, that protected pulp can preserve genetic material for tens of thousands of years. For scientists, these teeth weren't just fossils sitting in a drawer. They were genuine time capsules, offering a real chance to recover Neanderthal's genetic code in something close to its original state. Fieldwork ultimately placed Thorin's life somewhere between 42,000 and 52,000 years ago, a window confirmed through Bayesian statistical modeling that combined radiocarbon dating, careful stratigraphy, and the precise position of his remains within the cave's sediment layers. This timing places him among the very last Neanderthals to ever walk through the Rhone Valley, right as modern humans were steadily pressing in from the south. His remains now stand as the most complete Neanderthal dental collection discovered in France since the late 1970s, a genuinely rare bridge connecting the long-vanished world of his people to the forensic science tools available today. The focus on his teeth would soon shift from field notebooks out in the cave to a laboratory, where the secrets locked deep inside them could finally be coaxed carefully into the light. Inside an ancient DNA laboratory, the rules governing every action are absolute. Every surface gleams under ultraviolet lights, wiped down repeatedly until not a single stray cell remains anywhere in the room. Researchers put on full protective bodysuits, gloves, and face masks before ever stepping through the airlock. Any stray trace of modern human DNA could easily overwhelm the extremely fragile genetic material locked away inside Thorin's teeth, so even the tools themselves get sterilized between every single step of the process. The team carefully selects one molar from the catalog collection and places it under a microscope. Using a precision drill, they bore gently into the root, collecting fine powder from the chamber of dental pulp buried deep within. This is really the only part of the tooth likely to still preserve ancient blood cells, and along with them, the Neanderthals' genetic code. That powder gets transferred into a sterile tube, sealed shut, and moved into a separate clean room specifically for extraction. Throughout this entire process, every single action is carefully tracked. Who handled each sample, exactly when, and exactly how. Even the air inside the lab is filtered, and negative control samples run alongside every step specifically to catch even the faintest hint of contamination. Extracting usable DNA from a specimen more than 40,000 years old amounts to a genuine race against decay. Any surviving genetic fragments tend to be extremely short, badly broken, and mixed in with a huge background of bacterial and fungal DNA. The real challenge lies in isolating the original, authentic Neanderthal DNA from all the contaminant DNA that has quietly seeped in over tens of thousands of years. Modern sequencing machines can read through millions of individual DNA fragments at once, but only a small fraction of those fragments will actually belong to Thorin himself. The rest is essentially noise: microbes, cave sediment, and the occasional stray cell left behind by a modern researcher. Authentication ultimately relies on measurable, well-understood patterns. Genuine ancient DNA carries very distinctive damage at the ends of its strands, a kind of molecular scarring left behind by centuries upon centuries of chemical decay. The team carefully quantifies these damage patterns, calculating the precise ratio of authentic ancient DNA to modern contaminant DNA in every sample. In Thorin's particular case, the percentage of genuine, authentic Neanderthal DNA turned out to be surprisingly high, a rare stroke of good luck that ultimately made full genome reconstruction possible. By the end of the extraction process, the research team is left holding a single tiny vial containing essentially all that remains of Thorin's genetic legacy. Every safeguard, every sterile protocol along the way, had been carefully designed to ensure that the next step, the actual sequencing, would reveal not just a Neanderthal's genome, but a genuinely accurate record of an entire vanished world, confirming the date. The next step demanded proof solid enough to withstand the toughest possible scrutiny. Age estimates for Thorin's remains went through a whole battery of independent tests, each one specifically designed to rule out error and confirm the timeline already suggested by the cave's sediment layers. Radiocarbon dating targeted collagen preserved in animal bones found alongside the teeth, while optically stimulated luminescence measured the last time individual grains of sand had actually been exposed to sunlight. Bayesian modeling then combined all of these results together with the cave's detailed stratigraphy, ultimately producing a tight window of somewhere between 50 to 900 and 48 out 500 years before present. That window was narrow enough to silence most doubts. Every single method pointed toward the same surprising conclusion. Thorin belonged to the very tail end of the Neanderthal era, not to some forgotten, much older chapter of prehistory. Outside laboratories independently ran their own tests, repeating the measurements on fresh samples and cross-checking every number along the way. The research team eventually submitted their complete findings to Cell Genomics, one of the most respected journals in the field. Peer reviewers combed carefully through every method used, actively looking for any signs of contamination or subtle statistical sleight of hand. The data held up under that scrutiny. On September 11, 2024, the full results were finally made public. The announcement included Thorin's complete genome, his estimated age, and the strange paradox sitting right at the heart of the entire discovery. A genome that didn't fit. But the genome itself actually raised far more questions than it managed to answer. When population geneticists compared Thorin's DNA against their vast existing database of ancient and modern genomes, the results simply refused to line up properly. His genetic signature matched much older Neanderthals, individuals who had lived more than 100,000 years earlier, rather than his actual contemporaries elsewhere in Europe or Asia. The database essentially flagged his genome as a clear outlier, a mismatch that couldn't be explained away by simple laboratory error or faulty dating. This publication didn't just add one more individual to the Neanderthal fossil record. It forced every researcher working in the field to seriously reconsider what they thought they already knew about the species' final years on Earth. With the evidence now sitting out in the open as public record, this paradox remained wide open for the entire scientific community to debate. The underlying data was robust, the dating methods were sound, and yet Thorin's DNA was clearly telling a story that seemed to belong to an entirely different era altogether. The real question was no longer whether these findings were genuine. It became a question of how such an isolated lineage could possibly have survived in isolation for so incredibly long, and what that meant for the already tangled family history of our closest evolutionary relatives. 50,000 years alone. Geneticists began by carefully comparing Thorin's DNA against the vast existing catalog of Neanderthal genomes collected from sites scattered across Eurasia. The results were genuinely startling. Thorin's particular lineage had split off from other Neanderthal populations roughly 105,000 years ago. For nearly 50,000 years after that split, his ancestors remained genetically isolated, their DNA quietly evolving along a completely separate path, even as other Neanderthal groups elsewhere continued mixing and migrating across the continent. To put that timeline in perspective, it actually stretches longer than the entire span separating the very first cave paintings from today. Population genetic models built on coalescent theory map this divergence to a precise moment deep in the past, well before the last major glacial advances swept across Europe. Thorin's genome, carefully preserved inside the dental pulp of his teeth, effectively became a molecular time capsule. It carried the genetic signature of an ancient population that had remained completely untouched by the waves of gene flow that shaped the rest of the Neanderthal world during that same period. While other late surviving Neanderthals from sites like Vindija Cave in Croatia showed a genetic patchwork pulled from distant relatives, Thorin's genetic code stood apart entirely, echoing something from deep in the past instead. This ghost lineage, completely invisible in the physical archaeological record, only surfaced through the molecular clock embedded directly inside Thorin's DNA. No tools, bones, or artifacts had ever hinted at its existence beforehand. Only the slow, steady accumulation of genetic differences, measured out across thousands of generations, revealed that his group had spent countless years living on the margins, cut off entirely from the main currents of Neanderthal history. The mismatch between his surprisingly ancient genome and his relatively late survival forced scientists to seriously reconsider just how many other hidden populations might have existed throughout history, their stories locked away indefinitely, waiting for the right specimen to surface in exactly the right place. Thorin's DNA didn't simply add one more branch to the Neanderthal family tree. It opened up an entirely new window onto a vanished world, one preserved in genetic code rather than in stone or bone. The sheer scale of this isolation, and the mechanisms that maintained it for so long, set the stage for understanding exactly how vulnerable a population living in such a world apart could become. A genetic record of isolation. Thorin's genome reads almost like a direct record of isolation itself. When researchers mapped out his full sequence, they found long, uninterrupted stretches where both copies of his DNA were completely identical, clear evidence of many generations spent living within a small, closed group. These extended runs of homozygosity are essentially genetic footprints left behind by repeated mating between close relatives, a pattern that stands out sharply against the more varied patchwork genomes typical of other late Neanderthals. In population genetics, this kind of pattern points directly to a tiny effective population size, one where the actual number of breeding individuals had dropped so low that genetic diversity simply couldn't recover on its own. For Thorin's people, every single birth drew from an increasingly shrinking pool of ancestors, and every child inherited essentially the same ancient genetic code, generation after generation after generation. Molecular tests specifically designed to detect genetic admixture told a second related story, one of near total separation. Scientists use statistical tools to scan genomes for fragments of foreign DNA, actively searching for the telltale signatures left behind by mixing between different populations. In other late surviving Neanderthals found elsewhere in Europe, these tests routinely pick up small traces of Homo sapiens ancestry, a genetic echo of brief encounters as modern humans steadily spread across the continent. But Thorin's DNA came back showing zero such traces. Not a single genetic segment matched the pattern you'd expect from modern human ancestry. His entire lineage had remained completely untouched, genetically insulated from the newcomers who would soon come to dominate the surrounding landscape. The combination of extensive homozygosity alongside a complete absence of any Homo sapiens DNA paints a genuinely bleak picture for Thorin's small group. Cut off entirely from the wider Neanderthal world and denied the genetic refresh that normally comes with outside contact. Their long-term survival depended on an extremely fragile balance. Any new disease, any sudden climate swing, or even a temporary shortage of food could easily have pushed a population that small right over the edge. In the end, their genetic isolation wasn't simply an interesting historical quirk. It was a genuine vulnerability written into every single cell, one that would ultimately leave them defenseless as the surrounding world continued to change around them. Rethinking how Neanderthals disappeared. Neanderthal extinction no longer reads as one single sweeping disappearance. Instead, the accumulating evidence increasingly points toward a patchwork of very different fates, some groups gradually merging with incoming Homo sapiens populations, others slowly fading away in complete isolation, and a few groups, like Thorin's lineage, vanishing entirely while still carrying their genetic secrets intact. The traditional familiar story, where modern humans simply absorbed the last surviving Neanderthals through interbreeding, now stands alongside a much more nuanced reality. Today, people of non-African descent carry roughly 2% Neanderthal DNA in their own genomes, a genuine legacy of mixing that occurred with certain specific Neanderthal groups during ancient migrations. Yet this particular inheritance comes exclusively from lineages that, unlike Thorin's, never remained genetically secluded in the first place. Thorin's ghost lineage left absolutely no trace behind in modern human DNA. His people's story simply ended right there in the Rhone Valley, with their genetic code preserved only inside the pulp of a handful of ancient teeth. This realization effectively reframes the entire concept of extinction as more of a mosaic, some populations persisting forward through contact and mixing, others persisting for a time through stubborn, complete isolation instead. The Neanderthal ancestry that survives inside us today comes specifically from those groups who mingled with incoming humans, while entire separate branches, like Thorin's, simply disappeared altogether, their unique genetic contribution lost to history except for whatever ancient DNA technology can still manage to recover. What comes next? The search for other hidden ghost lineages is far from finished. Researchers are currently combing through additional caves across southern France, hoping to uncover more individuals who might help fill in the remaining gaps in this fragmented historical record. Each new discovery carries the genuine potential to reshape this story all over again, revealing just how diverse and unpredictable Neanderthal survival actually was across different regions and time periods. The extinction of our closest evolutionary relatives clearly wasn't a single, unified event. It was instead a series of separate local endings, each one shaped by its own unique combination of geography, climate, and simple chance. As ancient DNA technology continues advancing rapidly, the boundaries of what we can actually know keep expanding outward, inviting an entirely new set of questions and fresh investigations into our deep, shared past. Today, ancient DNA continues exposing hidden branches buried within our own family tree. Ghost lineages lost for tens of thousands of years, only now coming back into view. As sequencing technology keeps accelerating, every single new genome forces us to rethink what we thought we already understood about extinction, survival, and connection. This story was never really just about Neanderthals alone. It's about the deep complexity we all still quietly carry inside us, and the secrets our own DNA may still be holding on to, waiting to be found. What else might still be waiting out there, buried in the dust?